April 2024 didn't just change a war. It rewired finance. While headlines celebrated justice, something colder happened behind closed doors. Central bankers stopped trusting the system that ruled the world for 80 years. And once that switch flips, it never flips back. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The most powerful weapon the United States ever had wasn't missiles or sanctions. It was trust. Trust that U.S. Treasuries were untouchable. A political sacred. You could fight Washington, insult Washington, even compete with Washington, and your money would still be safe. Until it wasn't. When the G7 decided to siphon interest from Russia's frozen reserves, it looked harmless. Technica? Almost elegant. But to central banks watching from Beijing, Riyadh, and New Delhi, it sounded like a warning shot. Not to Russia. To everyone. Because if interest can be taken today, principal can be taken tomorrow. And if Russia's money isn't truly sovereign, whose is? That's when the exits began. No panic. No headlines. Just steady selling. Month after month, hundreds of billions sliding out of U.S. Treasuries like water through cracked glass. It's fear disguised as policy. And fear moves faster than ideology. What happens when the world's safest asset suddenly isn't to safe at all? Because the answer doesn't hurt Russia first, and the damage has started. Here's what most people missed. The freeze itself didn't break the system. Central banks expected punishment, they expected pressure, they even expected assets to be locked temporarily. That wasn't the shock. The shock was permanence. When reserves are frozen indefinitely, they stop being reserves. They become leverage. And leverage means obedience or punish. That realization spread quietly through central bank boardrooms like a virus. Imagine holding hundreds of billions meant to stabilize your currency in a crisis, only to discover that crisis itself is the excuse for confiscation. That's the paranoia layer. No headline explained, because reserves aren't investments. They're insurance, and insurance that can be revoked is worthless. So officials began asking a forbidden question. What if we're next? Not are we next? When no conspiracy, no secret alliance. Just math and self-preservation. The same instinct that makes people run from a burning building except this fire burns slowly. Selling treasuries wasn't a protest. It was a survival drill. They didn't dump everything. That would crash prices and hurt themselves. Instead, they trimmed, reduced exposure, shifted quietly. Exactly how professionals flee danger without drawing attention. And the numbers tell the story. Not opinions, not theories. Data. Foreign holdings didn't wobble. They declined steadily. Relentlessly. As if guided by an invisible clock, the moment interest was seized, doubt became certainty. And certainty creates movement. But here's the part no one asks yet. If foreign buyers are leaving, who's buying what they sell? Because someone always has to. This is where the story turns dark. Because markets don't allow emptiness. Every seller demands a buyer. And when the biggest buyers walk away, the system reveals who's been holding it together all along. There are only 4 possible buyers of U.S. Treasuries. Pension funds, households, private foreign investors, and the Federal Reserve. Pension funds are already saturated, overloaded with government debt they must hold, not want to. Households aren't increasing exposure. They're struggling with inflation, not lining up to fund Washington. And foreign private investors, they see the same risk central banks see. Political Caesar Dosen, Tekare Few, Republic or private. Which leaves one buyer, the buyer of last resort. The one entity that never runs out of money because it prints it, the Federal Reserve. Quietly, without press conferences, the Fed began absorbing what the world was shedding. A few billion here, tens of billions there. Officially, it's called market stabilization. Unofficially, it's something far more dangerous. Debt monetization. When a central bank buys government debt because no one else will, the market has already failed. It just hasn't admitted it yet. And here's the trap. Every bond the Fed buys injects new dollars into the system. New dollars dilute existing ones. Dilution fuels inflation. Inflation scares foreign holders, which makes them sell more. That forces the Fed to buy more. It's not a crash. It's a spiral, slow enough to ignore, fast enough to be fatal. And once the Fed becomes the market, there is no exit. So what exactly pushed central banks from caution into action? The answer points back to one date, April 30th, 2024. That's the day the line was crossed. Until then, central banks told themselves a comforting story. This is temporary. The war will end. The money will be the rules will return. They needed to believe that, because the alternative was terrifying. But when the G7 announced the interest would be taken and sent to Ukraine, the illusion collapsed. Because ownership without income isn't ownership at all. From a legal angle, it sounded clever. The principle remains untouched. Russia technically still owns the reserves, but central bankers don't think like politicians. They think in control, and control was gone. If someone can decide where your asset is income goes, they decide what your asset is worth. Functionally, that's confiscation. The label doesn't matter. That single decision reclassified treasuries from neutral storage to political instruments, and once an asset is political, it's radioactive. That's when selling accelerated, not in headlines, in spreadsheets, in monthly reports, in balance sheets that only specialists read. China reduced exposure. Japan trimmed holdings. Gulf states quietly followed. Even intermediaries like Belgium and the Cayman Islands ins for foreign money began offloading. This wasn't coincidence. It was pattern recognition. Central banks didn't need secret meetings. They needed memory. They remembered Russia thought its reserves were safe too. And suddenly, everyone wanted distance. But here's the question no one dares ask yet. What are they replacing treasuries with? Because they aren't holding cash, they're choosing something the West can't touch. Gold doesn't answer to sanctions. That's the pivot. When treasuries became political, central banks reached for something older than paper promises. Something immune to emergency declarations. Something that doesn't require permission. Gold. Not ETFs. Not paper claims. Physical bars, stored inside domestic vaults. Under national control, and the buying wasn't subtle. For the third straight year, central banks purchased gold at levels not seen since the 1970s. The last time this happened, the global monetary system was about to break. That's not coincidence. That's precedent. China led quietly. Official numbers told one story. Reality told another. Shipments arrived without press releases. Vaults filled while treasuries emptied. Turkey, India, Poland, Gulf states. Different politics, decision. Because gold can't be frozen if it never leaves home. But gold isn't the only exit. Some reserves flowed into other currencies. The yuan's share ticked higher. Still small, but growing fast. Not because the yuan is trusted, but because it's outside Washington's reach. Others moved into commodities. Oil, metals, resources with intrinsic value. Assets that exist even if systems collapse. This wasn't ideology. It was redundancy. And redundancy is what smart institutions build when they expect failure. Here's the uncomfortable implication. Every dollar moved out of treasuries is a dollar that won't fund U.S. deficits. Every ounce of gold bought is a vote against the existing order, and the math behind that vote is brutal. Because the U.S. doesn't just borrow a little, it borrows constantly. And now the buyers are disappearing. So what happens when the world stops financing America's lifestyle? The answer isn't political. It's arithmetic. Here's the number that breaks everything. $7 trillion. That's how much the U.S. Treasury needs every single year just to survive. Not to grow, not to expand. Just to roll over old debt and cover new deficits. Before this shift, the math worked. Foreign buyers absorbed nearly a third of new issuance. Domestic institutions took another chunk. The Federal Reserve filled the gaps. It was a delicate balance, and it depended entirely on trust. Now flip the sign. Foreign buyers aren't purchasing anymore. They're selling hundreds of billions annually. That doesn't just remove demand, it creates extra supply that someone else must absorb. So the system swings violently toward the Fed. What used to be a supporting role becomes the lead. The Fed doesn't just stabilize markets now. It is the market. And that changes everything, because when the central bank buys the majority of government debt, price discovery dies. Yields stop reflecting risk. They reflect intervention. That's when currencies rot from the inside. The U.S. can pretend this is temporary, that once inflation cools, once geopolitics stabilize, buyers will return. But central banks don't forget structural risk. They plan decades ahead. Which means this isn't a cycle. It's a transition. And transitions have winners and losers. Some countries are positioning early. Some assets are absorbing capital flows that used to belong to Treasuries. Some systems are being built specifically to replace the dollar's role. In one country, in particular, benefits from every dollar that leaves the system. Not loudly, strategically. China doesn't need the dollar to collapse. It just needs it to weaken. That's the misunderstanding in the West. This isn't about replacing the dollar overnight. It's about removing dependence quietly, piece by piece, until leverage disappears. China watched what happened to Russia with clinical focus. Not outrage, not fear. Analysis, and the conclusion was simple. Reserves held in Western systems are not assets. They are hostages. So China adjusted. Treasuries were reduced steadily, not dumped. Just enough to lower exposure without triggering chaos. At the same time, something else expanded: parallel infrastructure, a payment system that doesn't touch SWIFT. Trade settled in UN energy contracts priced outside the dollar, loans to developing countries denominated in China's currency instead of America's. It's not dominance. It's insulation. And that's the danger, because reserve status isn't lost when another currency wins. It's lost when trust fragments, when no one wants full exposure anymore. That fragmentation is already happening. The Gulf states noticed. Allies, not adversaries. And still they diversified. Still they reduced holdings. Still they bought gold. That should scare Washington more than any speech from Beijing, because this isn't rebellion. It's risk management. And once the biggest holders exit, the illusion of safety evaporates for everyone else. But here's the real threat. This process doesn't end with selling. It ends with repricing. And repricing is violent. Repricing is where the pain becomes visible. For years, U.S. borrowing costs stayed low, not because debt was small, but because demand was guaranteed. When buyers believe an asset is sacred, they accept low returns. That was the magic. Now imagine that belief fading. As foreign selling grows, yields don't gently rise. They jump, because higher yields are the only way to attract reluctant buyers. And every percentage point increase multiplies the cost of servicing $40 trillion of debt. That's not abstract. That's budget math. At 4%, interest is manageable. At 8%. At 8%, it devours the government. Defense, social programs, infrastructure, all competing with interest payments that produce nothing. This is why the Fed intervenes. It caps yields, not because it wants to, but because it must. Let rates rise naturally and the system snaps. So the Fed buys, and buys, and buys, which creates the illusion of calm. Markets look stable. Auctions clear. Headlines stay quiet. But beneath that calm is dilution, more dollars chasing the same goods. Inflation doesn't spike once. It lingers. It erodes. It teaches people that holding Kashore bonds is a losing game. That realization doesn't hit Wall Street first. It hits households. And once the public understands that savings are melting slowly, behavior changes. Spending accelerates. Confidence cracks. Trust vanishes. And when trust goes, No central bank can print it back. So who pays the price for this shift? Because someone always does. The cost doesn't arrive as a headline. It arrives as erosion. Bondholders lose first. Not all at once, but silently. When yields rise, existing bonds fall in value. Pension funds, insurance companies, retirement accounts, trillions sitting in safe assets suddenly aren't so safe. Then consumers feel it. A dollar that once bought certainty now buys less every year. Imports cost more. Energy creeps upward. Everyday goods quietly reprice. Not overnight collapse, slow pursuer. The middle class absorbs it last and hardest. Wages lag, savings decay. Benefits lose real value. Social security checks still arrive, but they buy less food, less energy, less stability. The promise stays, the substance fades, and the cruel irony. This isn't punishment for reckless behavior by citizens. It's the delayed cost of financial weaponization, of turning the world's reserve asset into a tool of policy. Because reserve currency privilege was never free, it was rented. And the rent was trust. Once that rent goes unpaid, the privilege expires. History is clear on this. Empires don't fall when they lose wars. They fall when they lose the ability to finance themselves cheaply. Britain learned it after 1914. The transition took decades, but it was and now the same pattern is forming. Quietly, predictably, mathematically. Which leads to the final question. Can this be stopped? Or is the ending already written? Here's the hard truth. This can't be undone, not because the U.S. lacks power, but because restoring trust would require giving that power up. And no empire does that voluntarily to make treasuries safe. Again, Washington would have to renounce the right to freeze foreign assets. Permanently. No emergency loopholes. No political discretion. That means surrendering one of the most effective tools of modern warfare. It won't happen, so central banks adjust instead. They diversify, they plan for a future where treasuries are useful but not sacred, where the dollar still matters but no longer dominates. That's how reserve currencies die, not with a crash, but with a downgrade. The April 2024 decision didn't destroy the system overnight. It started a countdown, a slow unraveling where the Federal Reserve becomes the buyer of last resort, inflation becomes policy's shadow, and borrowing becomes expensive again. The U.S. gained leverage over Russia, but it lost something far more valuable. Belief, and belief is the foundation of every financial system ever built. Once it's gone, the math takes over. The Treasury market didn't fail in a single moment. It was killed by a choice, and history will mark that choice not the war as the turning point. Because Russia lost $300 billion, but America risked its financial empire. And the bill is still coming.